Sometimes when we read the parables, we put a spin on them that may not actually be there in the intent of the parable. So when the Lord tells the disciples at one point that God is like this distant judge that doesn't care about you, but he will listen to you if you just keep bothering him, he'll finally relent and say, I'm so tired of this person harassing me, and then he'll listen. And so obviously the Lord told that parable in order to encourage the people in prayer and in persistence in prayer. But for us to take the parable, the meaning of it, that you should pray and not lose heart, and turn it into God as a distant authority figure that doesn't care about you, and the only way to get his attention is to bother him incessantly. We could interpret it that way. We can interpret the injunctions in the gospel as well about forgiveness in the same way. God is a distant overlord that forgives you because you ask, and then you won't forgive, and so when he finds you, he's ready to throw you into jail. And in most cases, we would interpret that as he's going to throw you into hell. And you're going to be there forever unless you forgive. Do you see what's happening at the tone of what you're hearing when I say that? What is it? It's actually it's a way of interpreting the parables and what the Lord is saying as if he's throwing down an ultimatum, and that's really the point. You've been forgiven, so you better forgive, or else. But really, the prison that we find ourselves in when we fail to forgive is one of our own making. And we know that. We know how liberating it is to forgive. And so most of the time, even when we can't, we long to. We wish we could. We strive to because we feel like we are imprisoned in that unforgiveness. The problem with the man in the parable is he doesn't have that sense of conscience. He doesn't have that softness and tenderness of heart. He's lost it somehow. And so he will remain in that prison until he begins to desire to forgive, until he learns. He will suffer. How many of you, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I can ask how many of you struggle with forgiveness? Sometimes, and we encounter this even in the life of the church, many of you are married. How often do you struggle to forgive your spouse? How often are there things that get held on to, perhaps for a really long time? Maybe you've been offended by your children. Can you forgive them? Maybe you've been offended and hurt by people in the church. Can you forgive? It's extremely important because that bondage that we suffer in unforgiveness is really real. And it really does feel like somebody is seizing us and throwing us into a jail that we can't get out of. And so we pray often, every day. We say, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. We say, change my heart and make me new again. Soften me. Allow me to demonstrate the same mercy and the same loving kindness that you have shown me in a way that surpasses all limits and understanding you have continued to show me. And so may I learn to extend that same mercy and that same grace to others, always and in every circumstance. So I wanted to share that just so that you understand, I hope, that the Lord speaks, and even speaks harshly, only to set you free, not to lay down ultimatums in front of you, not to make you feel ashamed because you struggle with forgiveness, but to tell you the path towards freedom is the path of forgiveness. This is something that we need to learn. Last week, I'm going to shift focus a little bit. It's going to be 2 sermons in one, sort of. At least I'm aware of it, though. You know, when I was younger, and I probably still do this, but it's more common but I'll still recognize it, but it's common to preach, 5 different sermons in one sermon. At the seminary, Father Barnabas Howell was actually one of our instructors in preaching for a while. And his whole thing is you should just have 1 point in every sermon. More than that is too much. And he said it was the whole thing. You have 1 point, and you tell people what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. It's just 1 point. Because he said more than that, people start to get lost in what you're saying. And I know that's probably the case most of the time when I'm talking. It probably feels like I'm getting lost. And so I'm not, as much as I appreciate what Father Barnabas was saying and understand the utility of it, I've never been able to put myself into that tidy box. And maybe I could. I'll try to learn, for your sake. But last week, we talked about I talked about the holy fools and how their behavior is so outrageous and out of bounds. And part of what that, frequently when they show up in the history and life of the church, they show up at times when people have been really obsessed with externals and maybe have forgotten the spirit and the life about what they're doing. But I share that in the context of talking about external behavior, about etiquette, and why we do it. In order to be loving to the people around us and to do what we can to support one another and mutually build one another up. And especially when you have a large crowd of people gathering on a regular basis, you have to learn a lot in order for that group, for that body to gather in a way that's cohesive and harmonious and peaceful and loving. And I wanted to share with you something related to that again. And this is a wonderful book, by the way. It's called Beauty for Ashes: The Spiritual Transformation of a Modern Greek Community. And Bishop Militios, he was the bishop in this region. He was a simple monk that was elevated to the episcopacy and sent to this diocese, this metropolis, that was in a really terrible state. Most of the churches were filthy and unused. On feast days, they were empty. No one kept the fast. And as a matter of fact, when he got there, it was during Lent, and they had this big celebration, right? The bishop's here, and they're cooking lamb and all this other, like during Lent. And so at the bank, and then he had a great Vesper service that evening, which no one came to. The church was empty. And then he comes out, and there's this huge banquet, and everybody's there. They're ready for the wine and the lamb and the dancing during Lent. And he could have really laid into them and chastised them for their behavior. But instead, he just asked if they would bring him a bowl of lentils. And he sat at the table and ate with them. And so he started immediately to lead by example. But you see how that behavior, that was an external behavior. That was something about the bishop that he wasn't going to compromise his commitment and devotion to the Lord through keeping the fast. And it's interesting, right? Sometimes we think, and that's why within Orthodoxy, people often ask questions about, well, what if I go to somebody's house and they offer me food and it's meat and it's during Lent? Should I eat it or should I refuse it and say I can't eat that? In most instances, you would say, give glory to God, eat it with thanksgiving, and don't scandalize the people that have offered you some food and make them feel bad. Be humble. But you see how Bishop Melitios had to do something very different. Still exercising humility. But what was called for in the moment was not to break the fast. You see that? And how so there isn't any just, you always do this. We're a rule-following culture, so we're always we want a set of rules that are going to be applicable in every instance, at all times, in all places, and you'll never find an exception. And the Orthodox Church just doesn't live like that. We just don't. But Bishop Melitios, one of the ways that one of the key characteristics of what led to a revival of the church's life in his metropolis was actually the focus on external things. He made sure that the churches were beautified again and clean. He made sure that the chanting at the churches was elevated. He made sure that his priests looked the part when they were out in public. And all of these external things, you would think that, well, maybe that's a mistake to focus so heavily on those things. And I think especially being when I was in the vineyard, so in Protestant circles, the pastor, or when they would ordain someone, they would give them a Hawaiian shirt. And they did that intentionally, kind of to joke at and poke fun at the idea of holy orders. You see how different that is from Orthodoxy. And yet many of us come from a Protestant background, and we still hold that attitude. We haven't quite changed. We've been transformed in an Orthodox environment. And so we relish a certain degree of informality and come as you are, stuff like that. And the vineyard was really good at that. Come as you are. And Orthodoxy is a bit different. I think we would say, come as you are with a broken heart, but not stay as you are. And so there's a wonderful quote in this book about Bishop Meletios that it says he showed great discernment for balancing and building up in parallel the external and internal elements. He did not allow one to jump ahead without the other. As a result, they mutually reinforced each other so that as the spiritual life deepened, the traditions of the church were kept more faithfully. And as the traditions and outer externals of the church were kept faithfully, the inner spiritual life deepened. This spiral is one engine of spiritual growth. And then this is for me, a line for me. The job, and probably the parish council, the job of the clergy, and in particular the bishop, is to cultivate it. So the job of the clergy and the bishop is to cultivate this spiral between inner and outer renewal and building up. And I think that in talking last week, because there's another section as it continues on in the book that I think is really relevant. So what if you lose the spiral? What if it's no longer a mutual reinforcing of the inner spiritual life and the outward external behavior? And you just do one or the other. So we've already talked about if you just do the one, just the inner, there's nothing outer, it can start to create chaos in a community. But what if you focus all on the external and the inner spiritual life is gone? Bishop Meletios talks about how, well, I'll read to you these paragraphs. Bishop Meletios maintains that the condition of the external state serves as an indication of the inner spiritual state. There can be no division between the external and the internal in the presence of God. If one has an authentic relationship with Christ, it will influence the external elements of his or her life. As we saw above, but deserves repeating here, Bishop Meletios makes this point when commenting upon the relationship of the older generation to the younger generation in the church. And this is where he gets into what happens when you lose the inner spiritual life. He says, the older generation warped it because they introduced an opposition between internal conviction and external action. The older generations, although they lost the correct conviction, they maintained a compulsory service of decency, but one which could not be imposed upon the youth, because the youth want authenticity. And when looking at the inauthenticity of their elders, they rebel. Truly, they rebel, truly. And so what he's describing there is that frequently there was a compulsory just kind of taking on of, well, we keep the fast. We do the stuff. But why they do it, and the development of the inner spiritual life, wasn't a part of it. It was sufficient just to do certain external things by rote. And so Bishop Meletios is saying when kids see that, they desire authenticity, and they see that the behavior, the decency, the etiquette, the decorum, that it's all just a mask that's covering nothing. There's no substance underneath it. They rebel because there's no authenticity to it. And so the spiral has to be maintained between the inner life and external behavior in the church, always. And it's interesting, for many people that have grown up in the church, they often comment that they are impressed and blessed by how much converts know about the faith. But then they leave it at that frequently. It's like, well, you're not done learning. Just because you grew up in the church, why would you stop? Why would you think that it's enough to say, well, I learned all these behaviors and I'm good? And then why would catechumens think that once they've been baptized and chrismated, that they can stop? There's nothing more to know. I'm Orthodox now. What does that even mean? And it's a funny thing to think about. There's a saying that 100% of the fathers are 90% Orthodox. That might scandalize you. But if you read St. Gregory of Nyssa is my patron. And if you're familiar with all of his writings, you will find some stuff that's considered pretty unorthodox. And so it's like, if even the fathers weren't all the way there, then why would we think, oh, I can just stop? It's enough for me just to go through the motions and keep coming to church. Think about that, you know? And so I encourage you to continue on that path of learning and deepening and enriching your life. And there is certainly no lack of resources to do that. One way, of course, is to always stay connected with the scriptures and to read the scriptures daily. That's a chief thing to do. Another way is to learn more prayers. So you've learned certain things, Vespers, maybe in the morning prayers that you have in your book. There's other collections of prayers to Christ, prayers to the Mother of God, prayers to different saints that you can grow from and deepen your faith with. And then actually taking the time to read the Fathers, to read St. Athanasius. I guarantee you, if you read St. Athanasius's On the Incarnation, you will be extremely blessed by reading that book. If you never have, you need to read it. And so it's like, there's so much there. A lot of it's even free. If you go and look for the Church Fathers, and that says something about our culture. Mm-hmm. It says a lot of things that are really kind of paradoxical. The Bible is like the most important collection of books ever, right? And you can get it for free. Now, part of that is because of the goodwill of people that want you to have it for free. But other things, like if you want to read the Da Vinci Code, you got to pay for it. You know, if you want to read like other things, you gotta show me the money if you want access to this. And that says something about what society values. Where you put your focus and where people put their money. But so I'm starting to peter out in the talk, losing steam. We had a long morning this morning, and that was why some of this stuff I was going to cover in that little lesson in between liturgy and Orthros. But we were trying to get the sound system and the new camera set up, and it was kind of a crazy morning. And so Orthros started really late. Well, I kind of always start Orthros late, but it started later than usual. See, I'm talking about external behavior. That's something for me to grow in and get better. Right, Destiny? Being on time.
Yes, sir. Yes, Father.
Starting Orthodox on time.
You do what you want, Father.
Yeah. But so God bless you all, and I just want to encourage you to never stop learning more about the faith and about deep spiritual things, but also just about really simple things. Like all of us should know how to cross ourselves. It's a beautiful thing to be able to do that in unity as a Orthodox believers, even throughout the world. And so keep learning. Amen.